Hello everyone. So in this blog I would like to shed some light on a topic that's been a mystery for many developers for quite some time, and frankly when knowing more about this topic you can implement a very flexible, very robust security and authentication flows with MobileFirst platform. So today I'm going to talk about creating a custom MobileFirst platform foundation authenticators and login modules. So I'm going to talk about this topic in general. I'm going to talk about something that's called Worklight Authentication Protocol. Again, how it simplifies the way you can implement custom authenticator and custom login modules, and eventually I'm going to demo all of this, and the sample as usual will be attached to this blog and you will be able to download it and use it for your convenience. Okay, so agenda for today is basically I'm gonna go over briefly over the platform from the IBM MobileFirst Platform Foundation Security Model. I'm gonna talk a little bit about Worklight ProtocolAuthenticator class. I'm gonna talk about WorklightAuthLogin Module interface, and then we'll do a demo. And we'll also see a lot of sequence diagrams outlining in a nutshell what's going on. Okay, so before we proceed, it's very important that you already have some good knowledge of IBM MobileFirst Platform Foundation Authentication Model. Okay, so I will not go too deep into what is Realm, what's security test, what's Authenticator, and what's Login Module. I expect you have at least some knowledge about it. Okay, and you can get this knowledge by going to MobileFirst Getting Started page and looking at the authentication and security topic. I cannot include links in video, but I will include links under the video in the blog, but I did include QR code in case you want to look at it on your device. Okay, so once you go to the Getting Started page and look for authentication and security section, you will see about a dozen of different tutorials. Okay, and absolutely mandatory ones are authentication concepts, which actually explain the concepts of MobileFirst authentication model and authentication framework, and custom authenticator and login module. Okay, so here you can actually learn the basics of creating a custom authenticator and custom login module, and what can you get with it. Okay, so the rest are optional, but very nice to have. Those two are absolutely mandatory. You have to know this content in order to understand what I'm going to talk about. So let's do a brief recap of IBM MobileFirst Platform Foundation Security Model. Okay, so there is a notion of resources. Okay, and the resource is protected by realms, by different realms, which are defined in authentication config.xml file. Okay, so each realm consists of one authenticator and one login module. Authenticator is basically an entity that creates, issues challenges to the client, and collects user credentials, for example, login form sent by client. Okay, so Authenticator operates with client. It asks for credential, which means issues challenges, and collects those credentials from client. So login module is an entity that validates the retrieved user credentials, okay, and builds a user identity object. So it's not necessarily user credentials and user identity object. It can be a device credential and device identity, or any other kind of identity. Okay, so once again, Authenticator collects those credentials, login module validates those credentials. Realms can be grouped into security test for if you're using older security model of MobileFirst platform, or authorization scopes if you're using auth-based model of MobileFirst platform. Okay, so the realm used to authenticate users called user identity realm. Okay, so the realm that you use to authenticate user will give you things like user ID or some custom properties, and it's being called user identity. And the realm that's used to authenticate device is called device identity realm. That's the realms that are going to provide you with a device identity. Okay, so and it's up to a developer actually to decide which realm he wants to use to authenticate users, which realms he wants to use to authenticate devices. So MobileFirst platform does provide a very convenient defaults, but a developer can actually change that and implement his own user or device authentication. So moving to the next slide, this is basically how it looks like in authentication config file. Okay, so I'll actually start not with the top one, but from the middle. Okay, so this is how you define a realm. So in this sample you see on the screen, there's a realm defined called my realm. That's a custom realm. So the definition says that this realm will use login module called my login module. You will see it below. Okay, and in login module section, login modules, you can see that we define a login module called my login module. Okay, and that's the login module that's going to be used by this specific realm. Okay, so we're going to go a little bit deeper into that once we get to the sample. Okay, so in addition, this authentication config defines a custom security test called mySecurityTest, which has multiple realms inside of it. Some of them are realms, MobileFirst realms that come bundled out of the box. You can use them. Some of them, one of them is actually my realm. That's a custom realm that's created here in the authentication config file. So those realms include WL anti-XSRF realm to protect against XSRF threats, remote disable, the realm that allows to remotely disable and remotely notify your application, direct update realm, the realm responsible for direct update, device node provisioning realm, the realm that's actually responsible for getting device identity but without going through the provisioning process. Okay, so and my realm, this is the realm created here. This is a custom realm. So note that custom security test has is internal device ID equals true and is internal user ID equals true parameter. Attributes for those two tests. Okay, and that's basically how you tell this is the test that's gonna give you my device identity, and that's the test, that's the realm that's gonna give me my user identity. Okay, so in both realm and login module section you can see an entry called class name, an element called class name. So basically here you define the fully qualified class name or Java class. Okay, that is provides the implementation of your authenticator and login module. So this is the Java class that implements Authenticator, okay, and this is the Java class that implements login module. So during the server runtime, okay, the server, the authentication framework, will search for those classes once required, and we're going to go through the sequence diagram to see when exactly it's going to happen. Okay, and it will instantiate an instance of, in this case, COM Worklight Core of X form-based authenticator. It will create an instance of this class for each client session. Okay, so it's important to understand that an instance of authenticator and an instance of login module is actually created for each client session. So authenticator and login module are stateful entities. They exist in HTTP session context. Okay, and every client session has its own instance of authenticator and login module. So basically, to finalize, this is the kind of diagram describing what Authenticator does and what login module does. Okay, so Authenticator communicates with client. It sends challenges to the client, okay, and it receives challenge answers from the client, okay, but it never actually validates credentials. Authenticator is once again responsible for getting the credentials from client. Authenticator knows which credentials client should supply. Authenticator can check whether client supplied all the required credentials. Authenticator can be responsible for multi-step authentication, okay, but it never actually validates credentials. So the login module in its turn doesn't know anything about client. It never communicates to the client directly, okay, but it does know how to validate credentials. So the separation here between authenticator and login modules actually helps to achieve a higher security level, because client never actually talks directly to login module, and login module does have access to the user registry, so login module can send credentials and validate whether those credentials are good or not. Okay, and the communication between Authenticator and login module is performed by MobileFirst authentication framework. Okay, so once again, Authenticator is client-facing, login module is more of a user registry-facing. They communicate with the help of MobileFirst authentication framework. Okay, but client never talks directly to login module, and Authenticator never talks directly to user registry. Authenticator never validates credentials. Okay, so this is important to understand because we're going into more technical flows soon. So let's see, and once again here I'm explaining in a nutshell what happens during the client request when client is trying to get access to some resource on a mobile first server. Okay, so whenever client is making a request to the server, okay, this request, any request, is intercepted by the authentication framework. Okay, so any request client makes to the server is intercepted by authentication framework. Now, authentication framework already knows about authentication config XML file and is aware of the fact that some resources are protected by some security tests, which means some realms. Okay, so authentication framework will know which realms are actually protecting that specific resource. Okay. So authentication framework is aware of those realms, and initially user is not authenticated in any of those realms. So neither user or device or well, application. So there is no authentication in any of those realms. So in order to get access to that resource, client first need to authenticate in all of those realms. And I'm being very generic here. Okay, so authentication framework knows which realm has which authenticator and which login module. So it starts actually talking to authenticators. Okay. And authentication framework will go one by one to each authenticator, okay, and it will ask it whether how exactly the client needs to authenticate. Okay, what client is supposed to do with this request. So, and it's actually up to authenticator to decide whether it wants something from client, whether it's okay to let this request through. Okay, we'll see all of those options, right? But by default, then let's say in regular situation, each authenticator will return some kind of a challenge. Okay, so this challenge can be anything. Okay, literally anything. It can be HTML, it can be JSON, it can be binary data if you really want to, because in Authenticator, as you will see soon, you have direct access to HTTP request and HTTP response objects. So technically you can do anything. Okay, so in this today in this specific blog, I would like to focus on something that's called Worklight Protocol Authentication, which means your challenges are JSON. And since challenges are JSON based, authentication framework can actually group them and create what's called a composite challenge. So authentication framework will not have to, your client basically will not have to process each challenge separately because they are supposed to be supplied in a different way. So for example, if one of your realms uses form-based authentication, it means that HTML of the login form is supposed to be returned to the client, which means it cannot be concatenated with JSON challenge. Okay. But in today's blog, I'm focusing on a Worklight authentication protocol, which means everything is based on JSON. Okay, so each realm is returning a challenge. Okay, this happens one by one. This is not a async request to each realm. This is a synchronous process. Okay, and the framework first asks realm 1, then realm 2, then realm 3, and each realm in its turn return a specific challenge. Okay, so authentication framework combines all of those challenges, okay, and returns a single what's called a composite challenge to the client. Okay. So on the client side, of course, you got your challenge handlers, okay, and those challenge handlers are receiving those challenges. So in a scenario that you might be familiar with, okay, you use a client-side API for challenge handler called isCustomResponse. Okay, so today we're going to look at the way how we can actually avoid using this isCustomResponse and actually delegate this logic to the authentication framework. So this will make your code cleaner and simpler. Okay, but basically challenge handlers receive those challenges, okay, and it's up to developer to actually process those challenges and supply answers to those challenges or do authentication in some custom way, okay, and eventually they submit some kind of a credentials. Okay, and once again, those credentials are intercepted by authentication framework because every single request is intercepted by authentication framework. So those challenges, challenge answers are returned to authenticators. Okay, so authenticators can actually extract those challenge answers, okay, and decide whether this challenge answer is okay or not. Not validate those challenge answers, but just to decide whether authentication framework can move to the next phase, which is validation. Okay, in case, for example, a simple test, the challenge answer was null, okay, or was shorter than authenticator expected, okay, like zero chars. Okay, Authenticator can return challenge once again, saying the challenge answer your credential username too short, right? But Authenticator cannot validate it to be a correct valid username and password. But once Authenticator decides that, okay, so this username and password now can be validated, they are good enough to proceed to the validation logic, it returns a specific status, and we will see this once again today. It returns a specific status to authentication framework saying, okay, those credentials look good, so now you need to validate them. Okay, so authentication framework in its turn next will go to login modules, and it will supply those credentials to login modules. Okay, so since we have 3 realms, we have 3 login modules, and credentials for realm 1 will be supplied to login module for realm 1, credentials for realm 2 will be supplied to login module of realm 2, and vice versa. So, and it's not necessarily that all credentials are successfully validated from the start. Okay, so in this example you see on a screen, actually realm 1 does successful validation of credentials, right, and it returns success. However, realm 2 and realm 3 actually fail because credentials are not good. Okay, so what happens now? Realm 1 is aware of the fact that credential validation has succeeded, right? It doesn't give you challenges anymore. However, Realm 2 and Realm 3 are still not authenticated, so they will return challenges once again. And it can be a same challenge or it can be a different challenge, so it's up to the developer to actually decide. Okay, so once challenge 2 and challenge 3 are returned, the whole loop starts again. Composite challenge is returned to the client, so this time it only contains challenges for realm 2 and realm 3. Okay, so this time only 2 out of 3 possible challenge handlers work and supply answers. Okay, and once those answers are supplied to the authentication framework sends challenge answer 2 and challenge answer 2 to Authenticator, right? Authenticators will tell it, okay, go validate them, so challenge answer and well, that's actually credentials will be sent to login modules. Okay, and let's say this time both of them are validated successfully, so all the realms are satisfied. Okay, and only once all the realms are satisfied, all the realms are authentication has successfully completed in all the relevant realms, the request will get the resource to the resource, and resource will return a response. Okay, so this is in a nutshell what MobileFirst authentication framework can do for you. Okay, so you can protect your resources with multiple realms. Okay, and if you're using Worklight authentication protocol, you don't have to authenticate in those realms one by one. Okay, so in case authentication framework sees that your resource is protected by several realms, it can send all the challenges to the client in one response. Okay, and client will, the authentication framework client side will actually wait for client to supply the answers to all the challenges. Okay, so the authentication is not happening one by one. Okay, and you're saving on extra round trips and necessary network traffic. Okay, so how this actually works. MobileFirst provides several interfaces and several base classes for actually making this happen. Okay, MobileFirst also provides several out-of-the-box available authenticators and login modules for most common cases. However, those interfaces of authenticator and login module, they are open, they are documented, right? And you definitely can use them to create your own server-side logic for authentication and for credential validation. Okay, so the first class that we're going to look on is Worklight Authenticator. So Worklight Authenticator, it's an interface. It's a base interface which you can implement, and it has several methods that allow to implement the functionality I was describing. So the first method is init. Okay, so this method is called when the Authenticator instance is created. Okay, so once it's created, the init method will be called, and it takes the parameters that are specified in the definition of the realm in authentication config file. So once you define your realm, which means you specify a class name for your authenticator, you can also add parameters for it, and I will show it to you once we get to the sample code. Okay, and basically those parameters will be passed to the init method, and you can process them in your code to actually define some behavior for your authenticator. So the next method is process request. Process request is called for each request from an unauthenticated client. So in case framework detects that this client, the request is incoming from a client that is not yet authenticated with this realm, the realm that this authenticator belongs to, it will trigger a process request function. Okay, and in this function, developer can actually decide whether he wants to challenge that client, or whether he's okay with unauthenticated client, or whether he wants to fail that client in general. Okay, so it's up for a developer to decide. You will see it once we get to the code. Once authentication is completed, so once client have authenticated with this specific realm, all incoming requests will reach the process request already authenticated method. Okay, so this method, as I've said, is called for each request from an authenticated client that has already authenticated. So get authentication data, that's a method that will be used by the authentication framework to get credentials for login module. So once authenticator has told the authentication framework that it's okay to start working with login module, it's okay to try to validate the credentials, the framework will actually trigger get authentication data method, so the credentials, the authentication data, can be supplied to the login module. You will see this in the sequence diagrams next. Process authentication failure method will be called in case login module returns a credentials validation failure. So once login module will try to validate credentials and say, okay, those credentials are not good, the authenticator method process authentication failure will be triggered. Okay, and here you can actually decide, developer can actually decide what exactly he wants to do, whether he wants to allow client to try once again, or whether he wants to block clients from trying, or what exactly the next step. So get request to proceed method is deprecated, so we will not focus on it. And change response on success method is called after authentication success. So once login module has reported that credentials were successfully validated, the framework will trigger change response on success method. So this method is optional, okay? And basically it can be used to return a custom response to the client. As you see in the method signature, it has a direct access to HTTP servlet response. So in case you want to return any custom response, and be it pretty much, it can be anything you want, you can write directly to output stream. Okay, you can technically do it here. Okay, so this method returns a boolean, and it should return true in case you do want to override the response with your custom content, or return false in case you're not doing anything, you're not changing response on success. Okay, this is important. So note that most methods like process request already authenticated, and process authentication failure, most of them, all of them are returning authentication result. Okay, so authentication result, that's actually what tells authentication framework what to do next, whether to send challenge to the client, or whether to start a trigger login module so it would try to validate those credentials. Okay, so we will see it once we get to the sample code. Also note that most of the methods have direct access to HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response objects. Okay, so this basically means that developer can read directly from request and write directly to response. So this means that the authenticator is kind of like HTTP filter. Okay, but it works in a specific way, the way dictated by authentication framework, by MobileFirst authentication framework. But technically, you can do anything you want with request and anything you want with response. Okay, basically, you can return anything you want as a challenge. So, for example, form-based authentication returns a login form by writing the login form content directly into the response object. Okay. So on top of the Worklight Authenticator interface, there is an abstract class called Worklight ProtocolAuthenticator. So what's so special about Worklight Protocol? So as you recall, I just said that technically you can write any content to servlet response object and read anything you want from server request object, okay? And that's a very low level functionality. That's HTTP level functionality, working with input and output streams, okay? Very low level functionality, okay? However, it is possible to simplify it. Okay, and Worklight Protocol Authenticator, that's exactly what it does. It simplifies the whole thing. Okay, so when using Worklight Protocol Authenticator, the assumption is your challenge and your challenge response are JSON. Okay, in case you're fine with that assumption, in case you can build your authentication on top of JSON, okay, JSON object, basically issuing a JSON challenge and receiving a JSON challenge response, you should be using Worklight Protocol Authenticator, and it will make your life much easier. Okay, so because with Worklight Protocol Authenticator, you don't need to worry about reading HTTP request and writing to HTTP response. The framework will do the job for you. Okay, so for example, there are two additional methods in Worklight Protocol Authenticator class, and that's get challenge response and get realm name. Okay, so the Worklight Protocol Authenticator always knows which realm it belongs to. Okay, and by using one single API get challenge response, you can actually retrieve the challenge response that client supplied for that specific realm. Okay, you don't need to worry about parsing servlet request and getting the information you need, because you're working with Worklight Protocol and your logic is built on top of that. Okay, so Worklight taking care of mobile first platform authentication framework, taking care of the internal infrastructure work. You're getting direct access to the challenge response object. Okay, and that's a JSON object. As you will see, it will return a JSON object. Okay, so next thing we're going to look at is WorklightAuthLogin Module. So WorklightAuthLogin Module, it's an interface you can implement, okay, and it has several methods. So the init method is very similar to Authenticator init method. It's basically called when Authenticator, well, they should be a login module. Let's wait. Yeah, that should be saying login module. So the init method is called when the login module instance is created. It takes parameters that are specified in the definition of the login module in the authentication config XML file, and we will see it once we get to the sample code. So the login method, okay, is used to validate supplied credentials. So if you recall, Authenticator class, Authenticator has a get authentication data method, okay, that returns a map of authentication data, and that map that returned by Authenticator is actually supplied to the login method of login module. Okay, so login module returns Boolean value. It can return true in case credential validation was successful, and it can return false otherwise. Okay, and in case you want to supply an error message, okay, you can just throw a runtime exception with that error message, and it will be received in the authenticator. Okay, so you could actually send that error message all the way to the client, and we will see how to do that. So login method is used to validate supplied credentials and tell authentication framework whether the validation was successful or did it fail. Create identity method is used to create an identity object that will be associated with that realm. Okay, so in case you're authenticating users, you create a user identity. In case you're authenticating a device, you're creating a device identity. But basically, identity is kind of like dictionary object that has several properties. And we will see it once we get to the code. Okay, so this method will be automatically invoked by authentication framework once login method has returned true. Okay, so once this occurs, the create identity will be triggered automatically, and it needs to return a user identity object instance. Logout method will be invoked once user or device or any other user of that realm logs out of the realm. Okay, so it can be triggered by client, for example, when client invokes WL client logout API, okay, or when session timed out. So basically, that's where you can do some cleanup and or do some additional reporting, anything you want to. Okay, so now prior to diving to the code, I want us to look at some sequence diagrams. So those sequence diagrams will cover several scenarios. They will cover a regular authentication flows first when you're not using Worklight Protocol Authenticator, when you're using just a standard authenticator. Okay, and then we will see what actually improves once you start using the Worklight Protocol Authenticator. Okay. So everything starts with create challenge handler. Okay, so in the application code, you're creating challenge handler, and you got the reference to your challenge handler. Okay, so and this is how you actually work with server issued challenges. So then you make a request from application code. Wait, from application code, jumpy, to the MobileFirst SDK. Okay, so you use some kind of API like invoke procedure or WL client connect, basically any API that triggers a request to the server. The SDK will make a request, okay, to the MobileFirst server, and MobileFirst server will detect that that request is actually, well, it's a new HTTP session. Okay, so this flow covers the new HTTP session. So once server detects that the new HTTP session was created, it will create the new authentication context, and that's something internal, the authentication framework internal. Okay, and it will create an instance of Authenticator and an instance of login module. So answering the question when the Authenticator and login module instances are created, they are created upon the first request to the protected resource, okay, when the server sees that a new HTTP session needs to be created. Okay, so Authenticator will be created, the init method will be called, login module, the init method will be called. Okay, once both Authenticator and login module have initialized, the authentication framework, the server, will invoke a process request method of the Authenticator. Now, Authenticator can process the request. As you recall, Authenticator has a direct access to the request object, and it can return object of authentication result class. Now, authentication result class contains authentication status, and status can be one of the following statuses: request not recognized, client interaction required, send response to client one way, success, or failure. Okay, according to the status that you return to the authentication framework, the framework will know what to do next. Okay, and that's why we're going to look into what's happening when you return each one of those statuses. Okay. So first status that we're going to look into is request not recognized. So in case Authenticator tells authentication framework that it does not recognize this request, this means that Authenticator doesn't care about this request. Okay, so from Authenticator perspective, the framework is free to proceed with that request all the way to protected resource. Okay, so in case you have several authenticators, okay, and as first one will get process request, it can return process not recognized. The framework will go to the next one. It can also return request not recognized. It will go to the next one. It can also return request not recognized. So in case all of the authenticators return request not recognized, eventually the request will get to the resource. Okay. However, one of the authenticators here in the middle can actually return a different status. Okay, and that's what we're going to look on upon next. So in case Authenticator detects that yes, this request requires authentication, it's not authenticated and it requires authentication, so the Authenticator returns status called client interaction required. Okay, so basically it means that the client required to provide some credentials, and those credentials are not necessarily interactive. It's not necessarily username and password. This can be HTTP header, it can be anything you want, right? But basically this means that Authenticator expects client to provide some kind of a credential, some kind of authentication information. Okay, so this is the status, and of course every authenticator can add a custom authentication challenge to that status. Okay. So as we will see in the code, we've already seen signature. Authenticator can write directly to the HTTP response. Okay, so it can be sent HTTP login form, HTML of the login form directly to the response. So this will be considered the auth challenge. Okay, but basically the client interaction required tells authentication framework, okay, now you need to return challenge to the client, and client needs to provide some information. Okay, so in case Authenticator needs to do direct access to the response object, okay, most probably that's going to be the only challenge that will be returned to the client. Okay, in case you're not changing the response object manually and you're just supplying auth challenge as JSON, and this is what's called Worklight Authentication Protocol. Okay, those authentication challenges can be grouped into composite challenge, and they will be sent to the client in one chunk. Okay, so once Authenticator supplies challenge, and this can be multiple authenticators that supply challenge, a MobileFirst server will send the challenge all the way back to the client, so the SDK will detect that this is the challenge. Okay, in case you're not using Worklight Protocol, it will trigger isCustomResponse function because it does not have a way of actually automatically knowing which challenge belongs to which realm. Okay, so you're not using Worklight protocol. This means your challenges are custom. So in this case, the SDK will go one by one to every challenge handler, and it will ask it isCustomResponse. So the first challenge handler that will reply true, okay, is considered challenge handler that should be handling this challenge. So challenge handler that replies true will immediately get a handle challenge invocation from the SDK. And in this case, once challenge handler was asked to handle a challenge, developer is actually responsible for collecting and handling credentials. Maybe in this case, developer will need to do submit login form invocation, maybe it's going to be submit adapter authentication, maybe developer needs to go to some third-party server, authenticate and get back some access token from that third-party server. For example, if you use, I don't know, Twitter, Google, Facebook auth, in this case you need to go out to the third-party server, authenticate, and get back with access token from that server. So eventually, once the client has decided, the developer has decided that authentication process has completed, it needs to report back to the SDK that the authentication was successfully completed. So, and this is done by challenge handler's submit success function. Okay, so once challenge handler submits success, okay, the SDK will actually make the original request again. Okay, and once again, this request will go through process request function at the authenticator. So in this case, authenticator is basically returning to that point. Authenticator can try to extract credentials. Authenticator can return client interaction required in case those credentials are not good enough. Once again, not validate. I'm not talking about validation, but just saying those credentials are not good enough to even start validation process. Okay, so here at this point, once again, authenticator can decide on action and return one of those statuses that we were talking about. So the next diagram is actually what happens when authenticator returns success status. Client makes request. It can be with some credentials. Okay, so for example, like in previous flow, client is trying to submit credentials. Okay, so this is happening. The credentials are being sent to the server. So SDK makes this request, okay, which contains credentials. Okay, server goes to Authenticator. So Authenticator tries to extract credentials, and Authenticator can see that, okay, this request does indeed contains credentials. Okay, so those credentials can be validated now, so Authenticator returns success. And this doesn't mean that it's a credential validation success. It means that Authenticator has successfully extracted credentials. So success means that authentication framework can now start validating those credentials. So once Authenticator returns success, the authentication framework will trigger get authentication data function. So now Authenticator needs to supply that authentication data. Okay, so it returns the authentication data. And next step, the authentication framework will trigger login function of login module, supplying that retrieved authentication data. Okay, so login module in the login function, the login method actually needs to validate those credentials, and I'm assuming it does that by going to some kind of a user registry, or it can be any other logic. So eventually that user registry will report either success or failure. Let's assume it reports success. So login module, the login function returns true, okay, which tells MobileFirst server that credential validation was successful. So the MobileFirst server will invoke a create user identity method, which means that login module needs to create user identity now and return it back to the MobileFirst server. So this user identity will be associated, associated with that specific client. Okay, with the client per realm. Okay, so then MobileFirst server will ask Authenticator whether it wants to change response on success. Okay, and in this case, Authenticator can return either true or false. So in case Authenticator returns true, this means Authenticator is interrupting the rest of the process, and it wants to return some custom response. Okay, for example, some additional HTML or some additional content. Okay. So in this case, the authentication framework will not be able to actually combine JSON object because one of the authenticators is overriding it. But in most cases, you would want to return false here, and you do not want to change response on success. You just want the authentication framework to process with to proceed with the regular flow. So once this happens, the authentication framework, in case there are no other realms that require authentication, will actually go to the resource. It will get response. Response will be sent all the way to the client. Okay, and here the SDK can once again ask whether it's a custom response. So in this case, no, it's false. So no challenge handler detects a challenge here because it's not a challenge, it's actually a response. And in this case, response is sent all the way back to the application code. Okay, so this is the case of authentication and actually getting good credentials and validating those credentials and getting a successful response. So the next flow will be Authenticator does return success, which means credentials are successfully supplied, but credentials were not successfully validated. So the regular flow, process request with Authenticator, credentials are extracted, Authenticator returns success, which means credentials are successfully extracted. Okay, so the framework gets authentication data, credentials are returned to the framework sends those credentials to the login function of the login module. Login module tries to validate those credentials, but user registry returns failure, okay, which means those credentials are invalid, password is not valid. Okay, so in this case, login module will return false. Okay, another option, you can throw an exception. Okay, and once authentication framework detects that login function that's returned false, it will trigger process authentication failure in the authenticator. And once again, you're at the same point. So in process authentication failure, you as a developer can decide whether you want to once again return client interaction required, which means client needs to supply credentials once again. Okay, or you can return a failure. Failure basically means that this authentication flow has ended. Okay, client cannot supply credentials anymore. Okay, so this is actually good in cases where you need to limit your authentication, let's say for 3 attempts. Okay, you can return a failure. This means that authentication process has failed. Fade in general, and there's no point in trying again. Okay, so MobileFirst Platform Foundation actually uses the status in cases of application authenticity failure. So in case your application is not authentic, there's no point in trying again. Okay, so it will not give you any good. Okay. So the next status is actually when Authenticator returns failure. Okay, so once the request is sent to the Authenticator and Authenticator returns status failure, right, MobileFirst server cleans the authentication context, which means the instance of Authenticator and login module are wiped, are cleaned. Okay, so because the authentication failed and you don't need to maintain that context anymore. So in case client will make another request, the new instances of Authenticator and login modules will be created. Okay, this is what clean authentication context means. And the framework will return 403, which means you cannot access. It will supply a reason, and that's a custom reason that you can define. Okay, and eventually the onFailure method of your invocation method will be triggered. Okay, so you will get a failure with that reason. So we will see all of that in a sample. So now let's see what changes when you use a Worklight protocol authentication. And as I said, Worklight protocol authentication is fully based on JSON. Okay, and this allows you to actually combine multiple challenges and multiple challenge responses in one request. And instead of actually as a developer being responsible to tell authentication framework when authentication was successful and when authentication failed by using submit success and submit failure methods in challenge handler, it's actually framework that will tell developer whether authentication was successful or authentication failed. And so developer has less work to do here, and you also have less round trips. because challenges and challenge responses are actually combined into one single JSON object. So the process starts when you're using create WL challenge handler API. Okay, so instead of creating a generic challenge handler, you're creating a WL challenge handler. Okay, and when you use this API, you have to supply realm. Okay, because this realm name is actually going to be how challenges are detected. So instead of invoking is custom response, the framework will search for the realm name, and this way the challenge will be mapped to your specific challenge handler. Okay, and also with this realm name, the framework will return challenge answers. Okay. So once you've created your WL challenge handler, you're making an initial request as usual. Okay, you're using some kind of a invoke procedure, connect, or any other API that triggers server request. So the request is sent to the MobileFirst server. Okay, process request method actually goes to the authenticator. Okay, and in this case, Authenticator returns client interaction required. We know what this means, and it returns a JSON challenge. So the Authenticator does not override anything in HTTP response. It returns a JSON challenge. Okay, basically a custom JSON object that can contain anything you want. Okay, so at this point, MobileFirst server will check all the authenticators, the rest of authenticators one by one, and it will generate one composite JSON challenge. Okay, so all authenticators will supply their challenges, and one big composite challenge will be sent to the client. So it will not be done one by one as it's done when you're using a regular challenge handler, but when you're using the Worklight authentication protocol, all the challenges are combined into one single JSON object and returned to the client. So it will be a for one response with multiple challenges. So this is a composite challenge that contains multiple challenges for multiple realms. It might contain for multiple realms. So here, the client side of authentication framework, it will actually find a challenge handler for every specific realm. Okay, so for every realm you have here, okay, it will find a challenge handler, and it will find it by the realm's name. Okay, because the composite challenge is a dictionary of realm name and the challenge. We will see it soon. Okay, so the framework can actually easily find the specific challenge handler for every realm. So instead of calling is custom response, the framework will directly go to handle challenge. Okay. In handle challenge, it's also much easier for a developer because developer doesn't need to submit manually his credentials by using submit login form or submit adapter authentication APIs. Okay, so developer needs to collect credentials from user. Okay, and developer needs to submit challenge answer. So this does not make a request. Submit challenge answer tells framework that, okay, I've collected credentials from user for that specific realm. Those are the credentials. Okay, so in order to access the resource, client is required to authenticate with 3 different realms. Framework is aware of that. So the request will not be sent again, okay, till the moment that the framework will get challenge answer for all of the realms. Okay, so for all of the required realms, because there is basically no need to send a request, it will fail. The framework is aware of the fact that it will fail because you're not authenticated with the rest of the realms yet. So at this point, challenge handler for each realm is asked to submit challenge answer, and only after all answers are collected, the framework makes a new attempt. Okay. So the next slide will be a continuation of this slide. Okay, so remember, we've finished with submit challenge answer. All the challenge handlers have submitted their challenge answers. Okay, only at that point the new request will be made. Okay, and the SDK will make a new request. The request will contain multiple challenge answers. Okay, and the authentication framework, MobileFirst server, will actually one by one again invoke process request on each of the authenticators. So authenticators will use a get challenge response method. Okay, and this is only Worklight ProtocolAuthenticator method. Okay, and that method will automatically return the JSON that's relevant for this specific authenticator for this specific realm. So you don't need to manually, as a developer, you don't need to manually parse requests and manually extract that information. You can use the convenience API get challenge response, and you're immediately getting that JSON object. So from here on, it's relatively easy. Okay, you send success. okay, which means the credentials were successfully extracted. Okay, get authentication data, similar to previous scenarios. The platform calls login with that authentication data. You can validate, the login module validates that authentication data with some kind of a user registry, returns true. Create identities invoked and identities created, right? And at this point, each challenge handler is asked to once again, this should be each authenticator is asked to process request, and relevant authenticators so relevant login modules. Yeah, I probably need to fix that first. Okay, so let's fix that. Okay, this is much better. So each authenticator is asked to process request, okay, and get authentication data is called for authenticators that return success, okay, success status, and relevant login modules are triggered. Okay, so at this point, this is the loop where each realm is processed one by one, okay, and since the challenge answers is JSON, it's actually easy to combine challenge answers into one single response. So once all the authentication flow is complete, once user identity being created for all the realms, okay, which means all the realms were successfully authenticated, the request is actually proceeds to the resource and response is returned. Okay, so and here in the response will actually contain some information that tells that MobileFirst server adds, and that information tells MobileFirst SDK, the authentication framework on a client side, that authentication success has actually occurred. So in this case, it is the MobileFirst framework, the client side of it, that will actually tell your challenge handler that success has occurred. Okay, so it's not you don't need as a developer to manually detect that. The framework will tell it for instead. The framework will tell you instead. And once this occurs, the response is actually sent back to the application. Okay, so next slide is actually what happens once you already authenticated. So once you authenticated, the request hits MobileFirst server, but the authentication framework detects that this client is already authenticated, so it goes to the different method, the method called process request already authenticated. And in this method, you can also return authentication result. Okay, so by default, the authentication result here, the result returned here is means that no interaction is required. Okay, request not recognized, because you're already authenticated, so there is no need to do. However, you can also make your custom code, add your custom code here, which means that even once you've authenticated for one time, more authentication might be required for that specific realm. Okay, so this is actually good in case you require client to provide some authentication on every single request. Okay, so and now I think it's demo time. So I will demo how this all works in an application. So let's start. This is my application and you can download it. It will be provided. So let's start with authentication config. Okay, so in my authentication config, let's start with realm definition. I've defined a realm. I call it custom realm because it's my custom realm. Okay, and I'm defining a class for authenticator. So the class, the fully qualified class name is com.demo.customAuthenticator. Okay, we'll go there pretty soon. Okay, and I'm also supplying a parameter. As I said, that's a completely custom parameter, so I'm decided to put a greeting message here. Okay, and you can change it every several months to something new, Happy New Year or some other holiday. Please provide your credential. So this is just a custom parameter. Okay, you don't have to edit if you don't want to. This is just for demo purposes. Okay, so this realm uses a login module called custom login module, and this is what I have here. So I have a login module called custom login module. The implementation class for this login module is also custom com.demo custom login module. Okay, and I can also specify parameters here. Okay, so in this demo, I will validate the received credentials against hard-coded values. Okay, so I will not go to any user registry. I've defined my username and password here, and it's MFP for MobileFirst platform. So in addition, my authentication will fail after 3 attempts. Okay, so this is a custom setting. I'm saying that maximum authentication attempt is 3. Okay, so I will do some manual checking to see how much failures already occurred. So this is authentication config, and I have a custom security test here. So it's called custom authentication security test. And note that I have several realms here. One of them is actually a MobileFirst realm, internal realm, anti-XSRF, because I want my application to be protected by anti-XSRF realm. Second one is device no provisioning, because I want the device to be authenticated. I want to get a device identity, so I'm setting is internal device ID equals true. And in addition, I'm setting a custom realm, okay, and I'm setting that this realm will provide me actually the user identity, okay. So in regular flow, okay, once you start with this custom security test protecting your application, you might see several round trips for this authentication configuration. You might see a first request returning for one for anti-XSRF. You might see additional requests for device no provisioning, okay, or those two combined, and you can see a separate request response round trip for this, okay. But since my custom realm, basically both Authenticator and custom login module will implement the Worklight authentication protocol, all of this will happen in a single request, okay? And we will see. So my security test name is custom auth security test, and I've protected my application only has a common environment. So in my application descriptor, I protect my common environment with that security test, custom auth security test, okay? And I think, yeah, my adapter, I got a very simple adapter. It's also protected by the same security test. So if you take a look at the JavaScript of my adapter, it's very, very secret data. It returns a hard-coded JSON object. Okay, so this is my security configuration. Now let's take a look at my application. My application is very simple. Okay, so I got a single button that will get data from JS adapter, okay, and I got a text area that I will output that data into, okay. So that's my main page, and I also have a login page. So my login page has two fields: username, password, and a login button. Okay, so this is extremely simple authentication and extremely simple UI. If I go to my browser, this is what it looks like. Okay, yeah, I probably need to start my server. Come on. Okay, so it will take a couple of seconds to start. Yeah, it's initializing, good. Okay, I think we're good. So hello custom security, I have the network tab here, so we can actually see what's going on in the network stack. Okay, and I'm displaying only XHR requests, not everything, not all of these. I'm just interested in XHRs, so in AJAX request. Okay, so let's take a look at the application code. So it's all in main.js. Okay, so I got a function called get data from JS adapter. Okay, so in this function, my invocation data is going to JS data adapter, procedure name get secret data. I'm using invoke procedure API. Okay, and once I received my data, I will put it into my output box. Okay, the response invocation result, I will put it here, and I will also, well, this is to format JSON, so it would look nice. Okay, note that I have a commented out code here that uses WL resource request. I will show you at the end that it works exactly the same. So this is my challenge handler. I'm creating a challenge handler by using WL client create WL challenge handler API, and I'm saying that's the challenge handler for custom realm. So the realm name is custom realm. I absolutely have to supply the realm name here. Okay, so here I'm creating a logger for that challenge handler. Okay, so note that I do not have is custom response function. Okay, because since I'm creating a Worklight Protocol Challenge Handler and supplying a realm name, I don't need to help authentication framework to detect whether that specific challenge belongs to that specific realm. No, the framework will do this for me, and I just have to handle this challenge. So as an argument here, I don't get the whole response. I just get the relevant part of it, the challenge itself. Okay. So my challenge will have the authentication status. It will be either credentials required or something else. Okay. So in case the status that is received in that challenge is credentials required, I need to hide main page. I need to show login page. I need to empty username and password. Okay. And in case that challenge contains error message, I want to display that error message on a screen. Okay. As simple as that. Very simple code. So login button click. Okay, instead of making requests to the server and submitting credentials in manual way, I'm just saying challenge handler, submit challenge answer. Okay, and I'm supplying a JSON object with username equals to whatever is in the username box, and password is whatever is in the password input box. So I'm submitting challenge answer not to the server just yet, but to the authentication framework. Okay, and authentication framework will actually know how to take care of that answer. So as I've said, we have multiple realms for defending, protecting our resource, protecting our application. So only once challenge answers for all of those realms are collected, the new request will be made. Okay, so also note this. Okay, the framework, instead of me telling framework when success has occurred or when authentication failed, okay, instead of me as a developer using challenge handler .submit failure .submit success, I'm actually delegating that to the framework. Since I'm using the Worklight authentication protocol, the framework has its own ways of actually understanding when success or failure has occurred. So I'm defining in my challenge handler process success function that will be triggered automatically. So once the authentication has successfully completed, I want to hide my login page and I want to show my main page, okay? Because this is what I do when authentication was successfully completed. However, if authentication has failed, I also want to hide login page and show main page, but I also want to show the retrieved data, the data that was returned, the failure data. I also want to output it into the output box. Okay, so the data that was returned in case of authentication success. So as you remember, once authentication was successfully completed, the original request is invoked, triggered once again, sent once again. So here I'm getting the data after authentication was successfully completed. So it's a very basic code, very basic code. It's much shorter than when you're using regular non-Worklight protocol authentication. Okay, and let's see it's in action. Okay, so next thing, let's take a look at our Authenticator and Login module. So let's start with Authenticator. So in my Authenticator, I'm creating a logger. Okay, note that my custom Authenticator extends Worklight Protocol Authenticator. Interesting thing as a useful instrumental thing that you can leverage is that the sources for the most of part of the authentication framework and out-of-the-box available authenticators and login modules are actually bundled within MobileFirst Studio. So if you want to take a look at the source code of Worklight Protocol Authenticator, you just command click it and you will see the source code. Okay, you will actually see the implementation of some of the logic. Okay, so if you want to take a look at, I don't know, just say, let's say form-based authenticator, if you're using this a lot, command click it and you will see the source code. Okay, same for header-based header login module, or that's header authenticator. Okay, so all of those classes are available in as a source code, and you can actually see them if you go to Java resources, libraries, WL server library, the Worklight extension API. You can actually see here a lot of files for that are bundled as a source code. So here you can see LDAP login module, you can see the source code, user, well, etc. A lot of different codes. So this is just as a side note. So back to my custom authenticator. The init function. As I said, the init method is invoked once Authenticator is instantiated. Okay, and as you recall, I have a greeting message, authentication config. I've defined a greeting message, okay, in my parameters for Authenticator. So this is how I extract it. Okay, the init method receives a map of options, string to string. Okay, and I remove the greeting message property from options. And in case in case it's not there, in case I fail to remove it, I can throw a missing configuration option exception. Okay, so this is optional. So this way you can create a mandatory and optional configuration options. Okay, so this will trigger exception in logs saying that greeting message property, which is greeting message, is missing the authentication configuration. Okay, so very easy, you can have a configuration for your authenticator. So next is process request. Okay, so in process request, I'm getting request, I'm getting response, and I'm also getting a boolean called is access to protected resource. So this boolean will actually tell my authenticator whether this request is trying to access a resource that's protected by this authenticator. Okay. So as I mentioned previously, all the authenticators are triggered for all the requests, and this allows authentication framework to actually be extremely flexible and implement pretty much any possible scenario. So in most cases, when is access to protected resource is false, you just need to return authentication result, request not recognized. Okay, so this is true for, I would say, 99.999% of cases. Okay, unless you're trying to implement some really advanced security scenarios. But not is access to protected resource equals false means that this authenticator should not protect that resource. Okay, and in most cases you just need to return request not recognized, which as we discussed means this request is irrelevant for this authenticator. So next, we're trying to use a get challenge response API. Okay, and we're trying to get the challenge response from the request. Okay, so as I said, that's HTTP servlet request. So you can do request get header, or you can do anything you want, but instead of getting the data manually, you have the API provided by Worklight ProtocolAuthenticator get challenge response. So this API will parse the request, and it will try to extract challenge response for this specific realm, okay, for custom realm. So in case the challenge response was null, okay, in case we haven't received challenge response, okay, so this means client has not responded with the challenge response with credentials just yet, okay, we're returning generate challenge. Okay, so we will see this function a little bit later. Okay, and generate challenge with greeting message, because that's our default greeting message. Okay, so however, in case challenge response is not null, in case the request does contain challenge response, okay, we extract username and password from that challenge response. Okay, because as you remember, main.js, as you remember, the challenge answer with supply is a JSON object which has username and password properties. So this is exactly what's going to be sent to the server side. We get username and password from that JSON object. Okay, we do some very basic, let's call it validation, but I would prefer to call it check. So in case username is null or password is null, or username length is 0 or password length is 0, we return a challenge saying username and password cannot be blank. Okay, so this is not a credential validation. This is just a simple check to see that those credentials, it makes sense to validate those credentials. Okay, because in this case, one of them is null or the length is equal to 0. It just doesn't make sense to validate them. We'll tell customer client that they cannot be blank. Okay, otherwise, we're returning authentication result with authentication status success. So authentication status success, as you recall, means that the authenticator has finished collecting credentials. Okay, so now login module can actually start validating them. Okay, and note here that we store username and password in this at the class instance variables. Okay, so here we're saving private string username and password. Okay, why? Because we will, in the next step, we will need to provide them to the login module. You will see that. So just to take a look at the generate challenge function, okay, it creates authentication result with a status of client interaction required. This basically means, okay, I'm going to send you a challenge, and we're creating a challenge object, just a regular JSON object, put in there authentication status, credentials required, error message, whatever was supplied here, error message, authentication result set JSON challenge object, and we're returning authentication result. Okay, so basically we're creating authentication result, setting JSON to that authentication result, and returning it. So it's as simple as that, and that authentication result has a status of client interaction required. And framework is actually smart enough to understand that, okay, that authentication result is JSON based, okay, so we can actually combine it with other Worklight protocol based challenges. So let's see what happens next. So as I said, next step, once Authenticator has returned success, okay, the framework will trigger get authentication data function. And this function is actually supposed to return a map object that contains the credential that login module will validate. So here I'm doing it very simple. I'm creating a map of authentication data. I got username key, it's defined above username. I'm putting password, and I'm just returning that object. So at that point, login module will be triggered. Okay, so I'll finish with Authenticator first, and then we will go to the login module. So once login module successfully validates the credential, okay, credentials, it will trigger, as I've said, the method called, we don't see it here because it's not part of the Worklight ProtocolAuthenticator, but I will show it to you here, the method called change response on success. Okay, since we're using Worklight protocol authentication, we don't need to manually change response on success. That's why the superclass of Worklight protocol authenticator always returns false. Okay, and basically this is why in our authenticator we don't need to even worry about that method, we just ignore it. Okay, so once login module has successfully validated the credentials, we're good. We don't need to do anything extra in our custom authenticator. Okay. So next, well, not prior to going to next subsequent request, in case login module failed to validate credentials, in case credentials were not successfully validated, the process authentication failure function of authenticator will be triggered. Okay, because now client needs to tell, authenticator needs to tell client what to do now. Okay, what to do next. So this function once again gets request, response, and error message. So if you want to, you can write directly to response, but you should not do that if you're using the Worklight authentication protocol. And one of the parameters here is error message. Okay, so in case error message is returned, you can actually use it in your code. So the login function, the login module, can actually return you some additional error message in case just saying that credential validation failed is not enough. Okay, so here in my logic, and that's a custom logic, just something that I've implemented, and you can do any other logic. Okay, so in my logic, I say in case this error message is null, okay, so in case no error message was returned from login module, that probably means that credentials were invalid. So login module just returned false, which means credential validation failed, okay. However, in case error message was returned, so login module is giving me some specific error message, and in my, you will see in my code, that's the only case that is possible is when user has made more than 3 unsuccessful failed attempts to authenticate. Okay. However, in case there is an error message, okay, I'm creating authentication result with status failure, and as I've said, status failure means there is no reason for user to proceed. Okay, so authentication has failed. Okay, and basically user can start the whole authentication process from scratch, but he cannot proceed the existing authentication flow. So I'm creating a JSON object called result.json. I'm putting failure reason, that error message there as the failure reason. Okay, I'm setting JSON to the result, and I'm returning a result, authentication result. So that's a custom logic because I wanted to demonstrate both request not recognized and failure statuses. Okay, so request not recognized basically means tell client to try again. Okay, failure basically means tell client that current authentication attempt has failed and there is nothing much he can do. Okay, he can start the whole process from the very beginning. Okay. So, and that's basically my authenticator. It's very simple, and you can download it and take a look at how it works. So the next class we're going to look at is login module. That's basically the last class. So in login module, I retrieve three properties from my configuration. Okay, authentication config. As you recall, we have username, password, and maximum authentication attempts. So in login module, I retrieve those three properties. Okay. I keep them as the instance variables, internal private. I'm going to keep the failed authentication attempts count. I'm going to have maximum authentication attempts, which I'm going to retrieve from configuration. I'm going to keep valid username and valid password that are going to be retrieved from configuration. And for some cases, I'm going to also keep received username, okay, because I will use it later to create user identities. So, init method. Once again, once a login module is created, instantiated, the init method will be invoked. So here I'm getting integer from my configuration, okay, and in case I'm getting a number format exception, in case I cannot parse it, I'm throwing missing configuration option exception. Basically, it will say that this property is invalid. I'm instantiating my failed authentication attempt count to 0, okay, because no attempts were made just yet. I'm extracting valid username and valid password from options, okay, valid username property, valid password property, and I'm checking in case there are null, okay, so I'm making sure that those properties do exist in my authentication configuration file, and once I've done all of that, I'm good to go. Okay, so once again, once Authenticator has returned status called success, this means framework will trigger login function of the login module. So, and authentication data will be received as it's supplied by Authenticator. So I'm retrieving my username from authentication data. Okay, here I'm using the same username key I've defined in my Authenticator. Okay, I'm retrieving the password. And note I have received username and received password, which I'm comparing to valid username and valid password that were retrieved from authentication config. So in case both of them equal, I'm just returning true. Okay, so I'm just telling framework, yep, credentials were successfully validated, so you can proceed. Instead of doing this hard-coded validation, you can go to some external source and try to validate those credentials, or you can do any kind of validation that you want, okay? So this is credential validation success. So in case they were not successfully validated, so basically we're not hit and return true, I'm increasing my failed authentication attempt count. Okay, and I'm saying in case my failed authentication attempt count is larger or equals to maximum authentication attempts allowed. So in case I've exceeded the maximum attempts, I'm going to throw new runtime exception with text maximum number of authentication attempts reached. And this means that my custom authenticator will get this error message. Otherwise, I'm just returning false. Okay, so this means the validation has failed and I don't need to return any text messages back to the authenticator, and this means authentication failed and I do want to return an error message to the authenticator. So let's just recall what happened when authentication failed. So in case error message was not returned, okay, and that's the case where I've just returned false, okay, so this is not the case of maximum number of attempts. In this case, I'm just returning a challenge saying invalid credentials. Okay, invalid credentials, but try again. Okay. However, in case I threw exception here with some text, this error message will be supplied to me here as a string error message, and I will actually create authentication failure, okay, with that error message. So back to login module. So once I return true, create identity method will be invoked. I'm creating here some custom attributes just to demonstrate that it is possible. I can add custom attributes to my user identity. So for example, here, if you queried LDAP server or any other user registry and you've collected some information that needs to be present in user identity, and user identity will be sent to client. Okay, it will be stored in server and sent to client. You can create your custom attributes object here. You create user identity object. Okay, so you supply a realm, so it's basically what you get in it's an argument in create identity. Okay, you can supply user ID, user display name, and other roles and other various attributes and properties of the user identity, and eventually you just need to return it back to the authentication framework. Okay, so in my logout method, I'm just setting receive username to null, received username, kind of doing some cleanup. Okay, so now let's see how this whole thing works. Okay, so once again, I'm in my application. Yep, I need to start my server again. It stopped because due to my inactivity. Okay, let's restart it. Okay, so as you can see here, I'm using, so in my init function, I'm using logger to actually output initialization options. So you can see here that login module, its initial options are username, max authentication attempts, and password. And for authenticator, it's realm, it's added automatically, and greeting message. Okay, so I can output my stuff in logs. Okay, so back to application, refresh. Okay, so note the network flow that's going on here. Okay, so I'm clicking get secret data from JSON adapter. I'm getting a query, one single request, okay, which returns 401. However, if we look at that 401 request, if we look at the so it's www.authenticate header contains WL composite challenge, okay, and that tells framework that the request contains composite challenge. So if you take a look at the challenges, you can see that 3 challenges for 3 different realms were returning single response. So there are no extra round trips. All 3 challenges were returning 3 responses. So there is a challenge for custom realm, that's basically my realm, with the error message, Happy New Year, please provide your credentials. Okay, there is a challenge for anti-XSRF realm and device no provisioning realm. So those 2 are processed automatically by the framework, okay, and the answers for those 2 realms, trust me, they were already supplied. However, framework is aware of the fact that this request, this adapter request, actually requires authentication in all 3 of those realms. That's why it doesn't issue more requests. Okay, it waits for the 3rd realm to actually supply challenge answer as well. So let's try to supply invalid credentials. Okay, let's try with blank credentials. So I do login. Note that now it says username and password cannot be blank. And let's take a look at the next request. So if I take a look at the request headers, okay, I have, let me copy paste this, the authorization header. I'm taking authorization header and I just want to pretty print it. Process. Okay. So the information that was sent to the server by authentication framework for my custom realm, username and password were blank. Okay, for my device no provisioning realm, that's the information that was sent, and where the server? Oh yeah, the information for anti-XSRF is actually supplied in a different way. Okay, so basically in a single request, okay, my client supplied information for all 3 of the challenges that server requested previously. So that's the information for custom realm, that's the information for device no provisioning realm, and WL instance ID, that's actually the information for anti-XSRF realm. Okay. So now the authenticator for custom realm, for device no provisioning realm, for anti-XSRF realm were triggered. Okay, everything besides custom realm, I'm guessing were successfully validated. Okay, and how I can check that? I go to my response. And in my response, I see only one challenge, okay? And that's exactly what I showed you in the very beginning of this video, okay? So 2 realms were successfully validated, okay? But the 3rd realm still needs authentication. So I'm getting back only the challenge for the realm that is not authenticated yet, okay? So now I can supply credentials, and that's bad credentials, as you recall, for that realm. So I do login. Now it says invalid credentials, try again. As you can see, once again, I'm getting just a single challenge. All status credentials required, invalid credentials, try again. Okay, and the minute I do the good credentials, logging, I will actually get 200. Okay, so that request, that second request, okay, the last request, okay, it will actually contain additional, in addition to secret data, okay, it will actually contain additional object called WL authentication success. Okay, so in general, this is processed by framework, okay, but you as a developer, you also have access to that if you really need it, okay, and that WL authentication success is server reporting to the client that all of those three realms were successfully authenticated. So it returns you identity object for device no provisioning. You can see here your device. Well, you cannot because it's a preview, but if it were running on the device, you would see your actual device ID, okay, anti-access RF information, and for custom realm you can see that device ID and display name and user ID, it's MFP, everything is MFP, and that's the custom attributes that I've set in my login module, in my user identity. Okay, so this information is processed by the server, and the method that actually I've invoked initially is triggered again, sent again every time until it actually succeeds. Okay, so the adapter invocation. So let's refresh this and see what happens if I actually fail for many times. Okay, so I'm doing login, that's failure, invalid credentials, I'm trying again, once again, failure, I'm trying again, and for the third time, when I try it for the third time, instead of 401, I'm actually getting 403. Okay, and that 403 contains WL authentication failure, and that failure actually says failure reason, maximum number of authentication attempts reached, exactly as I've defined it. Okay, and that means that the, let's go back to the application code, to main.js. That means that handle failure method was invoked. Okay, and this is basically the method that populated our output box. Maximum number of authentication attempts reached. So it's not developer that decides when authentication failed and when authentication was successful, but a framework. Okay, and developer can take actions in case authentication failure occurred or in case authentication was successful. Okay, so this is very convenient. Now let's see. Important thing to understand. As I've told you, at this point, all the authentication context was destroyed on the server side. Okay, but since I'm not keeping track of this maximum number of authentication attempts reached and my server side, okay, I'm not keeping some kind of a database that says, okay, this user is locked now. Next time I'm going to try to get data from JavaScript adapter, the authentication flow will start from scratch. Okay, because server doesn't keep my authentication context. Okay, server starts my authentication context from scratch. So in this specific case, you would need to have some kind of a database tagging user, flagging user as cannot authenticate anymore. Okay, because every time authentication fails, event fails, not interaction required, but authentication fails, the authentication context is created from scratch. So the last thing I want to show to you is actually how this whole thing works if you're not using invoke procedure, basically if you're not using JavaScript adapters, but if you're using a resource request. Okay, so I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going to uncomment this. So note that besides using a different API, invoke procedure, I'm changing it to WL resource request. I'm not changing anything else in my application. Okay, so now instead of going directly to my JavaScript adapter, I'm using a RESTful API, okay, which is protected by auth, okay, and not changing anything else, not touching my challenge handler. And once I get my response, I'm like always, I'm like previously, I'm putting it into output box and formatting it as JSON. Okay, so let's see how my application works. So note that the flow will be a little bit different now since we're doing the auth resource, okay, but it's still somewhat similar. Okay, so once I click the button, I'm going to get secret data. I'm getting missing authorization. Okay, so the framework detects that the client requires access token and basically authorization information to get access to that token, and it makes authorization request to the authorization server, which is a MobileFirst server. Okay, and here in this specific request, it's exactly like it was before. I'm getting challenges for all of my realms, similarly to previous scenario. I'm getting custom realm, anti-access RF, device no provisioning. So if I supply bad credentials, I will once again get 401, and this time I will only get challenge for custom realm because the framework has supplied authentication information for rest of the realms, and the authentication successfully happened here and there. Okay, so I'm doing MFP logging, so I'm getting the authorization to status 222, which means success. Then the framework gets access token, and eventually I'm going to get secret data again and getting my information. Okay. So since I'm using auth flow, authorization flow, I'm not getting WL success status answer here in my data, but I can use WL authorization manager APIs to actually get access to my user identity, device identity, and application identity. Okay. So I hope this video was useful. I hope you get now you understand the way custom authentication and custom protocol authentication works better, and you will be able to use it in your applications and in your setups.